The year was 1878, and the silence of Elias Vance's homestead was a living thing. It had weight and texture, a presence as palpable as the constant wind that scoured the vast rolling plains of Nebraska. The silence had settled in his bones 2 winters past, on the day he had buried his wife, Hannah, and their 6-year-old son, Samuel, side by side on the low hill overlooking the creek. Since then, it had become his only constant companion, a shroud he wore more faithfully than his coat. Elias lived a life pared down to its essentials: survival, memory, and the crushing inertia of grief. His days were a metronome of chores, a rhythm that kept him from sinking completely. He woke before the sun painted the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and rose, his first conscious thought always a dull ache of absence. He would mend the fences the wind had worried loose, chop wood until his shoulders screamed in protest, and check the trap lines that provided what little income he bothered to earn. He moved with a grim, practiced efficiency, a man who had declared a truce with sorrow but had forgotten how to negotiate for joy. His cabin, built with his own hands in a time of hope, was now a museum of loss. Hannah's rocking chair still sat by the cold hearth, its wood grain smooth from her touch. A small pair of scuffed leather boots, Samuel's, rested on the mantelpiece, a testament to a life that had barely begun its journey. Elias rarely looked at them directly, yet he was always aware of their presence, small anchors that kept him tethered to a world of pain he could not escape. The land itself, once a promise of a future, now felt like a cage. Its immense, unblinking sky and endless sea of grass only magnified his own insignificance, his own profound and suffocating loneliness. He avoided the nearby settlement of Northwood Creek. The town was a collection of raw timber buildings and hardened faces, a place where pity felt like accusation and concern felt like intrusion. He saw his own loss reflected in the eyes of the townsfolk, a mirror he could not bear to face. They saw a man hollowed out, a ghost haunting the edges of their burgeoning community, and he saw in them a world that had moved on without him, a world in which he no longer had a part to play. So he remained on his land, a solitary island in a vast ocean of prairie, letting the silence and the wind slowly erode what was left of him. The storm came on without warning, as they so often did on the plains. One moment, the sky was a placid, washed-out blue. The next, it was a churning cauldron of angry grey clouds. The wind, usually a steady whisper, rose to a frantic howl, carrying with it a blinding veil of dust and grit. Elias had just managed to secure the animals in the barn when the sky broke open. He stood at the cabin door, watching the world dissolve into a violent, chaotic blur, the sound like a freight train intent on tearing his home from its foundations. It raged for the better part of an hour, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it passed. The wind gentled, the dust settled, and a strange, watery sunlight filtered through the bruised clouds. A world scrubbed clean and raw was left in its wake. Elias stepped outside to survey the damage, his eyes scanning the property line where the storm had snapped a fence post clean in two. It was then that he saw it, a small, dark shape crumpled against the mud-splattered earth. His first instinct was an animal, perhaps a deer caught in the maelstrom. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into the form of a child. It was a boy, no older than 9 or 10, his dark hair matted with mud, his buckskin clothing torn and soaked through. He was Native American, that much was clear, and he was terrifyingly still. Elias's mind, long accustomed to solitude, recoiled. A knot of unease and cold practicality tightened in his gut. This was trouble. Harboring an Indian child, especially one who appeared from nowhere, could bring the wrath of the boy's tribe or the fearful prejudice of the town down upon him. His life was a fragile, carefully constructed shell of isolation, and this child was a stone poised to shatter it. He should walk away, he told himself. Leave him be. It was not his concern. But as he stood there, paralyzed by indecision, the boy stirred. A weak, shuddering breath escaped his lips. Elias's gaze fell upon the child's small, still face, and in that moment the carefully built walls around his heart began to crumble. He saw not a stranger, not a threat, but a child, vulnerable and alone. He saw the ghost of his own son, Samuel, pale with fever in his final hours. The memory was a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. With a low curse that was more a prayer than a profanity, Elias bent down. He slid his arms beneath the boy's frail body, surprised by how little he weighed. The child was burning with fever. As Elias lifted him, the boy's eyes fluttered open for a brief second, dark, fathomless, and filled with a terror that went beyond the storm. Then they closed again, and the boy was limp in his arms. Elias turned and carried him back toward the cabin, the heavy silence of his world irrevocably broken. Inside the cabin, Elias laid the boy on Samuel's old cot, the one he hadn't had the heart to dismantle. He worked with a gentle competence he thought he had forgotten, washing the mud from the boy's face and limbs, his touch clumsy at first, then more certain. The child's skin was hot and dry, his breathing shallow. Elias trickled water between his parched lips from a spoon, a few drops at a time. The boy swallowed weakly, his body still rigid with fear and fever. For 2 days, the boy drifted in and out of consciousness. Elias sat by the cot, a silent vigil keeper, a role he knew all too well. He brewed a tea from willow bark to fight the fever and made a thin broth, feeding it to the boy when he was lucid enough to take it. In those waking moments, the boy's eyes would fix on him, wide and watchful, the eyes of a cornered animal assessing a predator. He did not speak, not a single sound passed his lips. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Elias woke to find the boy sitting up on the cot, his gaze clear and intelligent, though still deeply wary. The silence in the room was different now. It was not the silence of emptiness, but of appraisal. "You're awake," Elias said, his voice rusty from disuse. "You were in a bad way." The boy just stared at him. "Can you tell me your name? Where you from?" Elias tried again, keeping his voice low and even. The boy's expression did not change, but he shook his head slowly. He then brought a hand to his own throat and shook his head again, more insistently this time. Elias felt a slow, dawning comprehension. The boy wasn't just silent from fear. He was mute. The realization landed with a thud in the quiet cabin, another layer of complication, another wall between them. The profound irony was not lost on him. His world of suffocating silence was now shared with someone who could not break it, even if he wanted to. The days that followed were a strange, delicate dance of observation and tentative communication. Elias went about his chores, acutely aware of the small figure trailing him like a shadow. The boy, whom Elias had taken to calling Chaitan in his own mind after finding a falcon feather clutched in his fist when he'd first found him, was a quick study. He watched everything Elias did with an unnerving intensity, from the way he split logs to the way he coaxed a flame in the hearth. Their conversations were a clumsy pantomime. A pointed finger at the water bucket meant thirst, a hand on the stomach, a plea for food. Elias found himself falling into a rhythm of gesture and expression, a language older than words. He would hold up 2 different vegetables from his meager garden, and the boy would point to one. It was frustrating and slow, a constant reminder of the chasm between their worlds, yet it was a connection, however fragile. Elias wrestled constantly with what to do. The nearest fort was a 3-day ride, and he shuddered to think what would become of a mute Lakota boy in the hands of the army. Northwood Creek was out of the question. The town's fear and hatred of the native tribes were a palpable poison. He was trapped by a sense of responsibility he had not asked for and did not want. Yet, as he watched the boy methodically feed the chickens, his small frame serious and focused, a strange and unwelcome warmth began to thaw the permafrost around Elias's heart. The breakthrough came one evening, nearly a week after the storm. Elias was sitting at the table, running a thumb over the worn leather of Samuel's little boots on the mantel. the grief ambushing him as it often did in the quiet twilight hours. The boy saw the shift in his posture, the sorrow that settled over him like a physical weight. He watched Elias for a long moment, his dark eyes filled with an understanding that seemed far beyond his years. Then, with a quiet determination, the boy retrieved a piece of charcoal from the hearth and a smooth, pale plank of wood Elias used for cutting leather. He sat on the floor, the board propped on his knees, and began to draw. His small hands moved with a surprising deftness and speed. Lines and shapes emerged from the black dust. First, a circle of tipis. A river snaking nearby. A campfire with figures seated around a tall man with a feathered headdress, a woman with a gentle face, a small boy, his family. Elias watched, mesmerized. The boy then drew himself, a small stick figure, chasing a bird with a hooked beak and wide wings, a falcon. He drew the sky turning dark and violent, the figure of himself lost, stumbling, falling. It was his story, laid bare with a clarity that words could never have matched. Elias felt a profound sense of awe at the boy's spirit, his fierce need to be understood. But he wasn't finished. He wiped the plank clean with his sleeve and started again. This time, he drew a map. It was crude, but the details were sharp and certain. He drew the creek that ran past Elias's property, marking it with a wavy line. He drew the sun in the east. Then, moving westward, he sketched a series of landmarks, a trio of distinct, jagged buttes, a river that forked like a serpent's tongue, a stretch of forest that looked like a dark smudge on the prairie. It was a path, a way home. In that moment, looking at the charcoal map, Elias no longer saw an anonymous Indian boy, a problem to be solved. He saw Chaitan, a chief's son perhaps, lost and loved, and desperate to return. And he saw in the boy's intelligent, expressive eyes a spark of life and resilience that he, Elias, had thought extinguished from the world forever. The cabin, once a tomb, now felt different. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared understanding, a quiet communication that ran deeper than speech. A flicker of purpose, something he hadn't felt since before the fever, ignited within him. He had to help him. He had to get him home. But first, they needed supplies. The larder was running dangerously low, and the journey laid out on the charcoal map would take several days. The thought of going into Northwood Creek filled Elias with a familiar dread, now sharpened by a new, protective anxiety. Leaving the boy alone on the homestead was unthinkable. He was still too small, and the prairie held too many dangers. Taking him into town was a risk of a different, more venomous kind. After a night of wrestling with the decision, he chose the lesser of two evils. At dawn, he hitched the mare to the wagon. He made a small nest of blankets in the back and gestured for the boy to lie down, covering him completely. Chaitan looked up at him, his eyes questioning but trusting. Elias placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. "Stay hidden," he whispered, the words feeling inadequate, no matter what. The journey to Northwood Creek was tense. Every gust of wind that stirred the blanket, every shift of the small body beneath it, sent a jolt of fear through Elias. He kept his face a stoic mask, but his hands were clenched tight on the reins. The town appeared on the horizon like a scar on the land, a place of sharp edges and sharper tongues. He tied the wagon in front of the general store, run by a man named Garrett Shaw. Shaw was a pillar of the small community, a man whose self-importance was matched only by his narrow-mindedness. He greeted Elias with a look that mixed suspicion and condescension. "Vance," Shaw said, his voice oily, "didn't figure we'd see you for another month. Running low on solitude out there." "Just supplies, Shaw," Elias replied, his tone clipped. He moved through the store quickly, grabbing flour, salt, dried beans, and a larger quantity of jerky than he normally would. He was aware of Shaw's eyes on him, calculating, probing. "That's a fair bit of food for one man," Shaw commented, leaning over the counter as Elias piled his goods. "Expecting company?" "Winter's coming," Elias lied, his heart thumping against his ribs. "Stocking up." Shaw grunted, unconvinced. As he was bagging the supplies, his young son, a boy of about 12 with his father's mean-spirited eyes, ran past the wagon outside. In that one fateful moment, a flicker of movement caught the boy's eye. A corner of the blanket had slipped, and a pair of dark, curious eyes had peeked out for just a second before disappearing again. The boy stopped, stared, and then ran into the store, whispering excitedly to his father. Garrett Shaw's face hardened, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure malice. He looked from his son to the wagon and then back to Elias. The pretense of civility vanished. "What are you hiding in that wagon, Vance?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Nothing that's any of your business," Elias said, paying for his goods and turning to leave. His blood ran cold. He had just loaded the last bag when Shaw appeared at the doorway of the store, flanked by 2 other men, Elias recognized as local malcontents. Their faces were grim, their eyes hostile. "Heard you found yourself some company, Vance," Shaw sneered. "The kind we don't take to in this town. Word is there's a bounty on any stray savage found off their reservation." Elias felt a rage, cold and pure, rise within him. It was an emotion he hadn't felt in years, a protective instinct he thought had been buried with his son. He climbed onto the wagon seat, grabbing the reins. "He's a child," he said, his voice shaking with a fury that surprised even himself. "And he's under my protection." "Protection?" One of the other men scoffed. "You're harboring a danger to us all. Now, you give the boy to us and we'll handle it, or things are gonna get ugly." Elias looked at their hate-filled faces, at the town that had offered him nothing but painful memories, and he made his choice. He snapped the reins hard. "Stay away from my land," he snarled, the words a raw promise. The wagon lurched forward, leaving the men standing in the dusty street, their expressions turning from angry to vengeful. As he urged the mare into a desperate gallop, Elias knew this was far from over. They would come for the boy, and he would be ready. The ride back to the homestead was a frantic race against time and the setting sun. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sound made him jump. The boy, Chayton, had pushed the blanket aside and now sat beside him, his small face a mask of grim understanding. He had heard the men's voices, had felt the shift from quiet tension to open hostility. He knew. When they finally reached the cabin, the last rays of sunlight were bleeding across the horizon. There was no time to rest. "They'll come," Elias said, as much to himself as to the boy. "We have to be ready." Together, in the fading light, they worked. Elias barred the door and shuttered the windows, leaving only small slits for his rifle. He checked his ammunition, his movements precise and economical. He was no longer a man adrift in grief. He was a defender, a fortress. Chayton, seeing what Elias was doing, did not cower. His fear had been replaced by a startling resolve. He found a sturdy branch Elias had set aside for kindling, and using Elias's sharpest knife, began to patiently whittle one end to a wicked point. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his hands steady. They were a team, a silent, desperate army of 2. The quiet of the prairie night descended, but it was a fragile, temporary peace. They waited. The minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the frantic beating of Elias's own heart. Then a new sound intruded, the distant, angry shouts of men and the clatter of horses' hooves. They were here. Elias moved to the window slit, his rifle cool and heavy in his hands. He could see them in the moonlight, a posse of 6 men, including Shaw, their forms distorted by drink and malice. They stopped just beyond the ring of light from the cabin's lanterns. "Vance," Shaw's voice boomed across the yard. "We know you're in there. Send out the savage and we'll let you be. This is your last chance." Elias's reply was the deafening crack of his rifle, a warning shot fired deliberately into the earth just in front of Shaw's horse. The animal reared, and the men scattered, their drunken bravado momentarily shattered. They answered with a volley of their own, lead balls thudding into the thick log walls of the cabin. The siege had begun. For what felt like an eternity, they exchanged fire. Elias was a careful marksman, making every shot count, aiming to intimidate, not to kill. But they were reckless and growing bolder. He saw a flicker of orange near the barn. One of the men was trying to set it ablaze. As Elias aimed his rifle in that direction, another man used the distraction to make a run for the cabin door, an axe held high. It was in that moment, when it seemed their small fortress was about to be breached, that the world changed. A sound began, low at first, a deep, rhythmic tremor that Elias felt in the floorboards before he heard it. It grew rapidly, a rolling thunder that was not from the sky. It was the sound of hooves. Hundreds of them. Over the rise to the west, silhouetted against the star-dusted sky, a wave of riders appeared. They poured over the crest of the hill like a dark river, a silent, formidable army of warriors on horseback. Their faces were painted for war, their presence radiating an immense, disciplined power that dwarfed the pathetic aggression of the town posse. At their head rode a man of imposing stature, his face a mask of stern authority, a magnificent eagle-feather war bonnet flowing behind him. He brought his horse to a halt, and the entire army stilled behind him, a sea of silent, watchful eyes. Shaw and his men froze, their weapons forgotten. The color drained from their faces, replaced by a stark, primal terror. They were trapped, hopelessly and utterly outmatched. The cabin door creaked open. Chaitin, his small face illuminated by the moonlight, ran out. He did not run towards Elias, but towards the towering chief. "Ate?" The cry was not a word, but a raw, desperate sound torn from his throat, the first sound Elias had ever heard him make. The chief, Tashunka, dismounted in a single fluid motion. He swept his son into his arms, holding him tight, his stern face melting into an expression of profound relief and love. He held Chaitin for a long moment, then set him down, his hand resting firmly on the boy's shoulder. He surveyed the scene before him, the bullet, scarred cabin, the terrified townsman, the smoldering torch near his barn, and his son, who now stood protectively beside the white man holding the rifle. His gaze, sharp and intelligent, took it all in. He understood. His eyes settled on Garrett Shaw. He did not speak. He did not need to. His look was one of cold, absolute authority, a gaze that stripped away their drunken courage and left them naked in their hatred and fear. One by one, the posse dropped their guns into the dirt. Without a word, they scrambled for their horses and fled into the night, their shameful retreat a far greater punishment than any battle could have inflicted. The immediate aftermath was thick with a silence more potent than any sound. The Lakota warriors remained mounted, a formidable circle of protection around the small homestead. Elias lowered his rifle, his body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. The great chief, Tashunka, approached him, leading Chaitin by the hand. One of the warriors beside the chief stepped forward. "I speak English," he said, his voice deep and calm. "Our leader, Tashunka, father of Chaitin, gives you his thanks." Tashunka spoke in the Lakota tongue, his voice a low rumble, and the warrior translated. "He says you gave shelter to his only son. You healed him and protected him from those men. You have shown a warrior's heart and a father's kindness. There is no debt great enough to repay this." Chaitin pulled on his father's hand, leading him into the cabin. He pointed to the cot where he had recovered, to the empty bowl from his last meal. Then he picked up the charcoal-marked plank and showed his father the drawings, the story of being lost, and the map that was to be his guide home. Tashunka looked at the drawings, then at Elias. His eyes, so fierce moments before, were now filled with a deep, quiet understanding. His gaze fell upon the small, worn pair of boots on the mantelpiece, and then back to the profound sorrow he saw etched in Elias's face. He nodded slowly, a gesture that conveyed a shared knowledge of loss, a grief that transcended language and culture. That night, the Lakota made their camp around Elias's cabin. The glow of their many small fires turned the isolated homestead into a bustling, living village. Elias sat on his porch, the threat of Shaw and his men replaced by the quiet, respectful presence of 500 warriors. His small patch of land, once a monument to his isolation, had become a sanctuary, protected by the very people his neighbors feared. It was the deepest irony, and it settled in his soul as a kind of peace. The next morning, they prepared to leave. As the warriors mounted their horses, Tashunka approached Elias one last time. Chaitan was with him. The boy stepped forward and held out his hand. In his palm was a single, perfect falcon feather, its edges tipped with white. He pressed it into Elias's hand, his dark eyes conveying a universe of gratitude and farewell. It was a goodbye more eloquent than any words could ever be. "This land," the translator said, relaying Tashunka's final message, "will forever be known to our people as a place of peace. The man who lives here is a friend. You will never be harmed by the Lakota. You are under our protection." Elias could only nod, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. He watched as the great chief lifted his son onto the horse in front of him. He watched as the entire party turned and moved away, melting back into the vastness of the prairie from which they came. He stood there long after they were gone, until they were just a speck on the horizon. The silence returned, flowing back into the spaces they had occupied. But it was a new silence. It was not the hollow, crushing weight of loneliness. It was a calm, clean quiet, filled not with absence, but with the resonant echo of connection. He looked down at the feather in his hand, a tangible piece of the miracle that had unfolded on his land. He had found a lost boy, and in doing so, had found a part of himself he thought was buried forever. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb. The prairie no longer felt like a cage. It felt like home. And for the first time in 2 long years, as he stood under the vast, unblinking sky, Elias Vance did not feel alone. He felt honored. He felt saved.